Hi, and welcome to More Human, More Resources, the HR podcast for entrepreneurs. I'm Vicki Brown, your host and CEO of Vidamaneo Enterprises. As a serial entrepreneur, I understand that having the right expert help has been critical to my success. That's why I'm dedicated to telling you, in plain language, what's going on in the world of HR that might impact your business and what you need to do about it, with real actionable tips to help you master that list of must-dos and grow your leadership muscle. First things first, the information contained in this podcast is provided for general purposes only and is not to be considered legal advice. Your decision to adopt or not adopt any practice or procedure mentioned in this podcast is solely yours, and we bear no responsibility for the outcome. We urge you to always consult legal counsel and other appropriate licensed professionals. And with that, let's get into the show. You're listening to Season 4, Episode 16. Well, people are people, and relationships can build over time, so it's natural that a more personal or even intimate relationship can easily develop at work. But why, how, and when should the company get involved? Well, let's first tackle why. And yes, I know the first thing that generally comes to everyone's mind is the specter of sexual harassment or allegations of harassment. And sure, that's absolutely the elephant in the room. So if you're in any type of managerial position, my advice is to avoid intimate relationships at work at all costs. You see, sexual harassment isn't actually about sex. It's about power. So when you have two people at different levels in the organization with different levels of power, well, then it gets really easy to see how the issue of possible sexual harassment can come into play. So if one person in that relationship has the possibility of power over the other, and no, it doesn't have to be their direct boss. Maybe Sally is part of the leadership team that can make recommendations about company strategy, and Mark is lower on the org chart. Well, Sally's recommendations very well might have impact on Mark, either positive or negative. And the simple fact that her actions could possibly impact Mark, well, that's a problem. And even if Sally is scrupulous about the decisions she makes, you also have to deal with the optics, the appearance of favoritism. After all, as I've said many times before, everyone is always watching everything. And if you think the team doesn't know what's going on, that it's some big secret, well, all I can say is it's not. What's that saying? Two people can keep a secret if one of them is dead. And then again, unfortunately, all too often, relationships end, sometimes badly and rarely well. And that means feelings are involved, usually hurt feelings. And that can mean that something that was just fine then isn't feeling so hunky-dory now. And that can give rise to harassment allegations too. Now, none of this is to say that sometimes it isn't actually intended sexual harassment. Someone is using their power over the other person to garner sexual favors. But if you're Sally, you also have to remember that Mark may feel like he has no choice because you're in a position of power. He may not directly say anything to Sally because he feels like he's in a no-win situation, and it may end up as a complaint directly to HR or his attorney. So see, if you're a Sally, just don't go there. Again, you may be thinking one thing, and Mark may be thinking another, or it may be fine while the relationship is going well. But if or when it ends, you might find yourself on the wrong side of things. Okay, that's one huge issue with work relationships, but not all work relationships end in harassment allegations. In fact, most don't. And while that's a good thing, there are still other problems. Work relationships can be incredibly distracting. Thinking about, anticipating, being overjoyed with the presence of the object of your affection, well, it leaves little room for mentally working out that production problem or preparing for that presentation. We all know how love, or even like, can be all-consuming. And keep in mind the rest of the team. They can feel the shift in politics. They know something's up. And when they figure it out, it can easily give rise to claims of unfair treatment or favoritism. And even if they don't complain, it definitely has a huge impact on culture because they'll always be unsure. Unsure if Mark got that plum assignment because he's good at it or because he's in a relationship with Sally. All right, so far I've been talking about two people at different levels in the business. But what about colleagues at the same level? Well, the issue of distraction still comes into play, and the impact on culture can definitely come into play as well. Two people in an intimate relationship on a team of three. You can see why that third person could easily feel like, well, a third wheel, somehow not quite part of the group. And when you have a team member that feels disconnected, that doesn't lend itself to them doing their best work. So now that we know the downsides, what can and should you, as the business leader, do about it all? Well, first up, you need to figure out where you stand. What's okay and what isn't. Back in the day, a lot, and I do mean a lot, of companies simply prohibited employees from dating coworkers. But in reality, and in today's world, those types of restrictions seem really out of place in most industries. So the most common way now is requiring notification, and the company can make a decision on a case-by-case basis. So that means your policy requires both parties to notify HR or management that the relationship exists, and it's best if they do this in writing. Now, a couple of points here. First, if it's what I'll call a manager-non-manager relationship, the burden of reporting should sit with the manager, meaning that if the relationship isn't reported, the manager is the person that will be disciplined. Because again, it goes back to the power dynamic. Perhaps Mark feels intimidated by Sally and like he can't come forward. That's why Sally is on the hook for making sure that relationship is reported to the company. Next, if it's a colleague-to-colleague relationship, then they're both equally responsible for reporting. Now, once you've been made aware, what do? Okay, if it's a direct manager situation, well, that's the most dangerous and difficult. As always, I suggest you have a chat with Labor Counsel. But I'll tell you that those types of relationships simply aren't allowed in our company. One or the other person has to leave the company, since we're not large enough to transfer someone far enough away from that reporting structure. In fact, I've worked with companies that the person leaving will always be the person in the management position because they're in a senior role and the company expects them to show better judgment and responsibility. The next most problematic is when the manager is in a different division. Again, though not directly, they're still in a power position. And finally, we have the colleague-to-colleague situation. You'll have to determine what makes the most sense for your business. But again, I almost always see some type of separation made, either with transfers or, in extreme cases, termination. Now, once you've determined what is and isn't okay in your business and how you'll handle things, then you'll have to memorialize it all in a policy. It can't just live in your head or by word of mouth. It should be a written policy that everyone has to acknowledge. You can just include it in your general handbook. Remember, one day you might find yourself in the unfortunate position of having to stand on that policy to take disciplinary action against someone. So it should be clear, thoughtful, and written down. And get help from your HR pro or labor counsel in putting that policy together. You'll be glad you did, now and later. If you found this information helpful, please leave a review and tell a friend. Thanks for spending the time. Until next week, same time, same place.